When was the first time that you spoke to my client?
At about 5 after midnight on the 27th.
Literally 6 hours after the event happened, correct?
6 hours, 5.5 hours. Yeah.
Okay. And at that point you knew, as was just testified to before you, that he'd been interviewed by Officer Singleton, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you had that information available to you, correct?
Yes, I did.
You also had the benefit of all of the other information, at least that which was gathered between 7:15 and midnight from Sanford Police Department, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you had been working a lot that night, talking to witnesses and interviewing people, correct?
Yes, sir.
And then you had told him at the beginning of the interview that you would like to do a walkthrough or a recreation the next day, correct?
Yes, sir.
Now, we've had Officer Singleton testify to this, but obviously he was Mirandized, correct?
Yes, he was.
And affirmatively waived that?
Yes, he did.
And you knew and you had advised him that had he wanted to stop the interrogation at any point, that was his right?
Officer Singleton did.
Okay. And he never stopped the interview, did he?
No, he did not.
Always was willing to answer all of your questions?
Completely.
Matter of fact, I think it was at the end, of course, you stopped the interview, Rhett, and said that at that point you had other things to do with the investigation.
Yes, sir.
And it was briefly, or just a quick check-in with Mr. Zimmerman at that point to get some questions answered, right?
Yes, sir.
Would you agree then that he was unaware of anything that you had discovered as what had happened at the scene?
I could safely assume that, yes, he was unaware.
I used the term that it was sort of a virgin interview, the one that he had with Singleton, right?
Yes.
First time anyone got to him, and that's a police technique, isn't it? You want to get to a shooter, a person who is at least a person of interest, as soon as you can, correct?
Yes, sir.
Before they are infected by additional information, correct?
Yes, sir. We refer to that as locking him into a statement.
Locking them in, okay.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
What's the reason for that?
So the information that he provides can be as pristine as possible without being contaminated by outside influences.
So, Investigator Serino, you had the information available from John Good, as well as other witness statements when you had this interview with Mr. Zimmerman, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you had talked to other ear witnesses, or at least read statements that other officers had gathered together of other ear witnesses as to what they heard, correct?
Yes, sir.
That included Ms. Lauer, who told you she heard what she heard,
Yes, sir.
correct? And her fiance as well, back then her fiance, right?
Jeremy Weinberg.
Yes.
Yes.
You had spoken to them yourself, I believe?
Yes, I have.
Okay. So, as you were now going back to Mr. Zimmerman, who did not have this information available to him, tell me what concerns you had with what Mr. Zimmerman told you that night that did not comport to the evidence that you were now aware of.
I had none at that time.
Okay. Did he seem to be cagey in his answering to you? Did he seem to be sidestepping your answers in any form or way to get around answering your direct questions?
No, sir.
Did he seem to do anything that, based upon your training and experience, evidenced to you that he was being less than straightforward with you?
No, he was being straightforward, in my opinion.
The question is this, and only refer to that document if you need to refresh your recollection. Okay. Was there anything in the interview with Mr. Zimmerman on February 27th at 12:05 that was specifically contradicted by the evidence that you had available to you at that point?
No, sir.
The fact that George Zimmerman said to you, "Thank God, I hope somebody did videotape the event or the whole event," his statement, what did that indicate to you?
Either he was telling the truth or he was a complete pathological liar, one of the two.
Okay. Now let's look at overall. Was there anything else in this case where you got the insight that he might be a pathological liar?
No.
Matter of fact, everything he had told you to date had been corroborated by other evidence you were already aware of in the investigation that he was unaware of?
Correct.
Okay, so if we were to take pathological liar off the table as a possibility just for the purpose of this next question, you think he was telling the truth?
Yes.
The witnesses that talked to you about the facts of the event, none of those facts presented by those witnesses contested Mr. Zimmerman's rendition of the facts, did they?
Not at that point, no, sir.
Including witnesses who were right there after the shooting had occurred that saw Mr. Zimmerman, correct? There was no conflict there, was there?
No, sir.
There was no conflict with the initial investigation officer who came on the scene. I think it was Tim Smith. What he told you did not conflict with what Mrs. Zimmerman had told you, right?
Not at all, no, sir.
One fact anywhere in that interview that was contested by a fact that you knew from the investigation?
None that I found.
In a situation like this, where you have what you believe Mr. Zimmerman went through, both parts of that trauma, and multiple interviews of him, would you expect that there are going to be some differences?
Absolutely.
And why is that?
Because we're not robots as people. I mean, not knowing him personally, I don't think I've ever heard of somebody remembering step by step exactly how stuff occurred that they were involved in, unless they're looking from the outside looking in.
Matter of fact, if someone were to come to you and have the exact same story down, fact for fact and word for word, sentence for sentence, each time you talk to them, what would you think about that person's honesty or veracity?
Either they're being completely honest or completely false to an extreme.
Okay, so in your interviews continuing as they were with Mr. Zimmerman, you would expect that things are going to change over time, correct?
Potentially, yes.
You would, and if they were to change in significant ways, if he were to add in some brand new fact or truly change direction, you would note that, correct?
Yes, sir.
Because that would in fact suggest a change not just in the presentation, but in the real substance of it.
Yes, sir.
And you're attuned to look for those as the investigator in this case?
Yes, sir.
And did you notice anything to bring to the jury's attention today that caused you that concern, that spidey sense that something's going wrong with what he's telling you?
Nothing I can articulate, no, sir.
Matter of fact, as we look at that video, as you looked at it, it was quite consistent with what he had told you before, correct?
Yes, sir.
And though it was longer and more was discussed, there was nothing in that recreation where he moved things around or did things differently or suggested things happened in a different location, did he?
Nothing major, no, sir.
Now, let's talk about, and we're building up to what I call the challenge interview. I know that's next, but let's stick on this one, the recreation interview. Okay. You, of course, had some more information. You had another day's worth of an investigation, right? Because you were working the case the entirety of the 27th, right?
Yes, sir.
So you had been gathering more witness statements and more of the law enforcement workup that was being done, correct?
Yes, sir.
Would you agree you probably had a dozen or 15 witness statements available to you on the 27th?
Approximately.
Right.
Somewhere there.
And had reviewed all of those in planning for your next communication with Mr. Zimmerman?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Did what he say on the recreation video contradict any of the witness statements that you had gotten so far by Friday, or sorry, the 27th at 5 p.m.?
Nothing directly.
Anything at all that you can explain to the jury where you looked at it and said, this piece isn't fitting?
Nothing as far as the information that he had given us, no.
Would you agree that any of the slight inconsistencies that did exist on that video you would sort of assign as just being the way interviews go?
Perhaps, yes.
Well, anything else besides that?
Nothing that comes to mind, no, as far as something that would have triggered something more than just me continuing to talk to him.
Okay. So then what you decided to take on, which is another useful police tactic, if you will, is what's called a challenge interview, correct?
At this point, I wasn't ready for one, but yes.
In focusing him on some of what you thought you might have to defend when you were saying that you'd have to speak for him and it's going to be under a lot of scrutiny, this whole question of whether or not George profiled him that you mentioned, right?
Yes.
And you sort of hit him with that pretty straight out of the box, right? Hoping maybe for a response that would give you an insight as to whether or not he was profiling Trayvon because Trayvon was black?
More of an explanation, and more of an explanation I was seeking.
Okay. So you asked him if he had been white, would you have reacted the same way? And he said yes.
Yes, sir.
Did that cause you any concern?
No.
Think he was being straightforward?
Yes.
Any evidence in your investigation to suggest differently up
No.
to that point? But you would agree that that was sort of something you want to play out there for him to respond to see if that might open something up?
There were external concerns about that, external concerns, and I needed to get that clarified.
Okay. And you did?
Yes, I did.
And had he had that question gone somewhere else, that may have led you down a different path.
Yes, sir.
Then there was this question about why he didn't simply acknowledge to Trayvon Martin who he was or what he was doing, correct?
Yes.
And you questioned him in a couple of different ways on that as well.
Yes.
Did his answer to you satisfy you?
Not necessarily.
Tell me what your concern was.
He had made reference to mentoring children, specifically African American children. Why it didn't occur to him to go ahead and try to say something to somebody he was following.
Sure. In hindsight,
Of course.
that might have resolved things.
Absolutely.
And there are actually probably 1,000 decisions in hindsight that would have changed the outcome of this event, right?
But specifically, as far as my interview with him, that was a concern.
That was a concern. And what he said to you, and referring to the tape, was, why didn't you, was it fear, precaution, safety, all the above? Tell me what's going through your head. And he said, I didn't want to confront him. That wasn't my job.
Correct.
Did that seem a reasonable explanation to you?
I took it at that, yes. Yes.
Another effort that you did, a sort of significant one, was when you told him that Trayvon Martin would videotape a lot of what he was doing, and that you believed that this whole event may well have been on video.
Yes, sir.
Correct?
Yes, sir.
Again, a very specific challenge interrogation technique, is it not?
Yes, sir.
When you can say, you know, there's that bank just across the street and they had just installed brand new cameras, night cameras, color cameras, and we got real good video. And the reason for doing that is because that's truly an attempt to let this guy know, whoever it is, that you got him, right?
That can serve a lot. That's more of a bluff.
Sure.
In this one, to say that I got him, that's, you know, that's just to put in his mind that
Right.
everything may or may not be there.
And I apologize, I spoke about two different events. This one
Okay.
specific event and then some guy across the street from a bank, so let me clear that up.
Okay.
Generally speaking, you might introduce the suggested existence of video evidence in order to flush out a true story.
Yes.
And in this particular case, that's what you were doing.
Yes, sir.
And you had suggested to Mrs. Zimmerman that there was a really good chance that Trayvon Martin's phone, which you had in your possession, but it was dead, the phone was dead and you couldn't really get it out yet, but that was a really good chance that was going to have a video of this whole event.
Yes, sir, I did.
And that was in effect to get him to, if there was something to come clean to, that he would come clean to it.
Yes, sir.
Knowing, as you said, that if it's there and it shows something you didn't tell us about, it's going to be really bad for you.
Yes, sir.
And that was the way you said it, right?
Yes, sir.
And that was the reason why you said it, right?
Yes, sir.
And that was all part of your challenge interview.
Yes, sir.
And what did he say when you told him that?
I believe his words were, "Thank God." I was hoping somebody would videotape it.
The fact that George Zimmerman said to you, "Thank God, I hope somebody did videotape the event or the whole event," his statement, what did that indicate to you?
Either he was telling the truth or he was a complete pathological liar, one of the two.
Okay. Now let's look at overall. Was there anything else in this case where you got the insight that he might be a pathological liar?
No.
Matter of fact, everything he had told you to date had been corroborated by other evidence you were already aware of in the investigation that he was unaware of.
Correct.
Okay, so if we were to take pathological liar off the table as a possibility just for the purpose of this next question, you think he was telling the truth?
Yes.